Imagine this, a man who once stood on stadium stages with guitars blazing, voices roaring in unison, now collapsing, silent, still broken. The crowd's cheers fade into a stunned hush. A note left behind, half-written. A photograph, him at 76, alone, fragile, eyes hollow. That image, so unexpected, so inconceivable, will haunt you through what follows. You will wonder, how does someone who seemed invincible come to this? What invisible weights did he carry? What final act of tragedy drove him past survival? This is not a celebration. This is a reckoning. I invite you to journey through the hidden corridors of Bruce Springsteen's life, through triumph and torment, through public adulation and private agony, to the moment when the legend cracked, when listeners gasped, when hearts broke. By the end, the shock will be answered, the heartbreak explained. But until then, you must follow every turn, every shadow, every silence. There are few names in American music that carry the emotional gravity of Bruce Springsteen. To the world, he is the boss, the blue-collar poet of New Jersey, the voice of lost dreams and working-class redemption. But long before his songs echoed through arenas, before the endless tours and awards, before he became the chronicler of America's soul, Bruce Frederick Joseph Springsteen was simply a boy from Freehold, trying to find a place where he belonged. This is where the first movement of his story begins, not with fame, but with fire. Bruce was born on September 23, 1949, in Long Branch, New Jersey, the son of Adele and Zerilli and Douglas Frederick Springsteen. His mother was a legal secretary, steady and dependable, a quiet source of light. His father, however, was a man caught in a storm of his own making. Douglas struggled to hold down jobs, battling depression and a sense of failure that shadowed the family. Bruce would later admit that much of his music, from Factory to Adam Raised a Cain, was a desperate attempt to make sense of that relationship. His childhood home was not one of ease, it was one of tension and unspoken pain. Nights would often end with Douglas brooding in the kitchen, beer in hand, as young Bruce lay awake, listening to the hum of silence that filled their house like an unwelcome guest. But somewhere in that silence, he found music. When Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, a young Bruce sat transfixed. He was just glowing, Springsteen would later say. That moment changed everything. It wasn't just the music, it was the power of it, the way sound could fill a room, transform an emotion, reclaim a life. Soon after, Bruce convinced his mother to rent him a $60 guitar. The moment he held it, he knew, this was his weapon, his salvation. Freehold was not a town built for dreamers. It was small, working-class, honest, the kind of place where ambition was often mistaken for arrogance. Bruce didn't fit in. He wasn't good at sports. He didn't attend his high school prom. He didn't even finish college, dropping out after struggling to adapt. But what he lacked in conformity, he made up for in passion. He began playing in small local bands, the Castiles, Earth, Steel Mill. Each one brought him closer to something bigger. He played in dimly lit bars, on flatbed trucks, anywhere that would have him. People didn't yet call him the boss, but even then, his intensity commanded attention. By the late 1960s, while much of America was consumed by the Vietnam War, Bruce's war was internal. He faced rejection after rejection. Record labels weren't interested. His voice was too raw, his lyrics too long, his sound too unconventional. Yet there was a fire in him that refused to die out. He knew the music industry wasn't built for people like him, but he was ready to tear down its walls if that's what it took. And he did. In 1975, Born to Run was released, and everything changed. It wasn't just an album. It was a declaration, an explosion of youth and desperation. Songs like Thunder Road and Jungleland didn't just tell stories, they lived them. Every lyric was a plea for escape, every chord a heartbeat. Critics compared him to Bob Dylan, calling him the future of rock and roll. But success didn't come without scars. During this period, Bruce was trapped in a legal battle with his former manager, Mike Appel, which prevented him from recording for almost 2 years. The very success he had fought for now held him hostage. This was the second movement of his life, the rise. But even then, the seeds of tragedy were being planted. He was learning painfully that fame was both a blessing and a curse. When Darkness on the Edge of Town finally arrived in 1978, it wasn't the triumphant anthem of a young star. It was the lament of a man who had already seen too much. The light that once burned with rebellion now flickered with reflection. The working-class hero had become its philosopher. Through the 1980s, Springsteen's legend grew unstoppable. The River, 1980, captured the American heart, love, loss, blue-collar dreams. And then came Born in the USA, 1984, the album that turned him into a global phenomenon. Stadiums overflowed. Flags waved. Millions sang along to what many believed was a patriotic anthem, not realizing it was a cry of pain, a story about forgotten veterans and broken promises. To the world, Bruce Springsteen was unstoppable. To himself, he was falling apart. Behind the confident smile and endless tours, there was a man battling exhaustion, self-doubt, and a loneliness that fame could not cure. The more people adored him, the more he retreated into himself. He once said, "You can't triumph without the possibility of failure." But what he never revealed then was how close that failure felt, even at the top. He married actress Julianne Phillips in 1985, but the marriage was strained from the beginning. She wanted normalcy, he was chained to the road. Within a few years, the relationship crumbled. His heart, already weary, finally gave in. And that's when he found love again with Patti Alpha, his bandmate, his mirror, his anchor. Patti became not just his wife, but the quiet center of his world. She saw the pain behind the persona and stayed. Together they built a family, 3 children, a home, a fragile peace. In the 1990s and 2000s, Bruce aged gracefully but carried his ghosts with him. He continued to write about America, not as an outsider but as its witness. Albums like The Ghost of Tom Joad and Devils and Dust stripped away the arena lights and exposed the poet again, the man who sang for the voiceless. Then came The Rising in 2002, after September 11th, an album that redefined healing through music. It was no longer about running away, it was about standing tall amid loss. Yet, with every reinvention, there was a quiet toll. Touring took its toll on his health. The weight of expectation pressed down. He began to speak openly about depression, therapy, and the darkness he faced, not for attention, but to save others from silence. And as he entered his 70s, the man once called the boss seemed smaller, slower, gentler, but infinitely more human. The curtain rises on this final act, the 4th movement of his life, not of glory but of fragility. Fans saw him back on stage, smiling, singing Born to Run as if nothing had changed. But behind that voice, behind those still powerful eyes, something was breaking. Something was coming undone, piece by piece. The world didn't see it at first. The lights, the guitars, the cheers, they all hid the truth. But soon, the tragedy of Bruce Springsteen, the one no one expected, would begin to reveal itself. And when it did, the world would be left in stunned, heartbreaking silence. The higher Bruce Springsteen climbed, the thinner the air became. The applause that once fueled him began to echo like an empty promise. Fame had given him everything: wealth, recognition, a voice that could shake the walls of arenas, but it had also taken something that could never be replaced: peace. Beneath the spotlight that burned so brightly, there was a man quietly unraveling. Bruce Springsteen's concerts were the stuff of legend, marathon performances that lasted 3, sometimes 4 hours. He would leap, sweat, shout, and pour his soul into every lyric until it felt as though his very heartbeat was synced with the audience's. But behind the raw electricity of those nights lay a brutal truth: the energy that electrified millions was slowly draining him. The E Street Band saw it. Patti saw it. The fans didn't. He kept moving, night after night, town after town, country after country. The endless touring, over 2,600 shows in his career, had become both his therapy and his punishment. He said once that when he wasn't performing, he felt like a ghost in his own home. The stage was where he was alive, but it also became the place where he hid. That constant motion was his way of outrunning the silence that waited off stage. Because in the silence, there were voices. The ones from Freehold. The ones that told him he'd never be good enough, never be safe, never be at peace. His crew often described how Bruce refused to stop rehearsing, even after the crowd had gone home. He would test sound levels alone at 2 a.m., adjusting microphones, walking the empty stage as if haunted by something only he could hear. To be the boss meant carrying the world, and himself, with unrelenting weight. By his 60s, the relentless years of touring and recording began to manifest in his body. Though he maintained remarkable stamina for a man his age, cracks began to show. Joint pain, fatigue, and eventually, more serious medical issues emerged. In 2023, Bruce made headlines when he postponed multiple shows due to peptic ulcer disease. It sounded minor to fans, just another bump in the road, but those close to him knew better. The ulcers had caused severe discomfort, extreme fatigue, and pain that made even speaking difficult, let alone performing. For someone who had built his life on resilience, admitting that he couldn't perform was almost unbearable. Canceling a show was, to Bruce, a kind of defeat. He'd say to his bandmates, "People paid to see a show. They came to believe." But the human body can only endure so much. The postponement stretched for months, and whispers began. Was the boss finally slowing down? Was this the beginning of the end? When he finally returned to the stage, fans cheered louder than ever. But behind the smile, behind the sweat and the denim, there was a man who had started to feel mortal for the first time in his life. And that terrified him. The physical pain was one thing, the emotional weight was another. For decades, Springsteen had sung of struggle and redemption. But what many didn't realize was that these weren't just stories, they were survival mechanisms. He was writing his way through his own darkness. Bruce had long spoken candidly about his battles with depression. "You don't know the illness you're fighting until it's already got you," he said in an interview. There were times, even at the peak of his success, when he could barely get out of bed. The world saw a hero, he felt like a hollow shell. Friends described how Bruce would disappear into isolation between tours. The family would hear his guitar faintly strumming late into the night, over and over, the same unfinished song. Sometimes he wouldn't speak for days. In his memoir Born to Run, he revealed that therapy and medication became lifelines. He credited Patty for saving his life more than once. When the depression came, it came hard. It turned joy into fear, love into doubt, light into shadow. Even as he smiled in interviews and accepted Lifetime Achievement Awards, Bruce was fighting battles invisible to the camera. He once said, "You can have all the success in the world and still feel like the same scared kid you were at 13. That fear never left him, it just wore different faces. Fame is a mirror that reflects what people want to see, not what's real. Bruce understood this better than anyone. He had mastered the art of appearing indestructible. Yet privately, he was a man carrying secrets too heavy to share. There were regrets that haunted him, friends lost to addiction, bandmates gone too soon, family moments missed while he was on the road. The ghosts of Clarence Clemens and Danny Federici, his band brothers, followed him everywhere. On stage, he would sometimes glance to his right where Clarence once stood, as though still expecting to see him there. And then there was his father, that lifelong ache. Even after Douglas passed away, Bruce spoke to him in dreams. "He's still with me," he said softly once, "and sometimes he's still angry." The tragedy of Bruce Springsteen wasn't just in his body wearing down, or his mind growing weary. It was in the invisible war he waged to stay whole, to keep being the man the world needed him to be, even as he sometimes felt like a stranger to himself. He wrote Letter to You in 2020, an album soaked in mortality and reflection. In it, he addressed aging, legacy, and death head-on. At 71, he said, "You realize the clock's running." But beneath the wisdom, there was fear. The idea of slowing down, of silence, terrified him. He couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't the boss. If there was one thing that tethered him to the earth, it was Patty and their children. Their marriage wasn't easy, 2 musicians, 2 public lives, and decades of emotional storms, but it endured. Patty was the quiet force behind him, often stepping in when she sensed the darkness returning. Their children, Evan, Jessica, and Sam, became his quiet sanctuary. Jessica, now an accomplished equestrian, once said, "When Dad's home, he's not Bruce Springsteen. He's just Dad." It was in those ordinary moments, watching his daughter ride, cooking with Patty, walking alone near their New Jersey farm, that he found glimpses of peace. But even then, something deeper loomed. As Bruce grew older, his family saw him become more introspective, more fragile, more haunted by his own legacy. "I've built a life out of songs," he once told Patty. "But I'm not sure what's left when the music stops." That sentence would echo in her mind for years. The man who once sang about running free now found himself trapped, not by fame, but by time. The applause that once healed him now felt like a reminder of how far he'd come, and how close the end might be. And though the world still called him the boss, the truth was beginning to surface. Bruce Springsteen was no longer in control. The tragedy that would soon unfold wasn't a single moment, it was a slow unraveling, the quiet collapse of a man who gave too much of himself to the world. But no one, not his fans, not even his family, was prepared for what came next. The story of Bruce Springsteen has always been one of duality. A man who lived between the light and the dark, between roaring stadiums and empty rooms. To understand the tragedy that began to shape his later years, one must look beyond the legend, into the quieter wars that few ever saw. He had long sung of struggle, of broken heroes and working-class ghosts, but what most listeners didn't realize was that he wasn't just telling their stories, he was telling his own. Bruce's honesty about his mental health is perhaps one of the most courageous parts of his life. While many artists hid behind fame or addiction, he faced his demons with a raw openness that stunned even his closest friends. In his 2016 memoir Born to Run, he wrote, "I know something about depression. You are not yourself. You lose all the color, all the music." Those words came from years of personal struggle. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, even during his most celebrated tours, Bruce experienced deep, paralyzing depressive episodes. Some days he would wake up unable to move, feeling as though the same force that drove him to create was also determined to destroy him.
He sought therapy. He took medication.
He read everything he could about mental illness, trying to understand why he could fill entire stadiums with joy yet still feel empty inside. Being the boss, he once said, was supposed to fix me.
It didn't.
Patty became his anchor. During one particularly dark period, she refused to leave his side. She called it sitting in the darkness with him until the light came back. But even love could not erase the scars of the past. The darkness didn't start with Bruce, it began long before him. His father, Douglas Springsteen, had struggled with mental health throughout his life, though in the 1950s, it went unnamed and untreated. He was distant, sometimes angry, often withdrawn. The young Bruce grew up not knowing whether his father would smile or glare at him when he came home. That uncertainty carved a permanent space inside him, a hunger for approval, for connection, for understanding. His father's silence became the shadow behind every song. "I was haunted by my dad," Bruce admitted. "I thought if I wrote enough songs, I might finally understand him." It was this unresolved tension, the longing to forgive, the inability to forget, that shaped his art but also tormented his soul. Generational trauma has a way of echoing through time, and Bruce's life was proof of it. No matter how many albums he released, no matter how many millions he inspired, there was always that invisible weight, the burden of the past, pressing down on him. As Bruce aged, the world around him began to change in painful ways. He lost close friends and collaborators, men who had stood beside him since the beginning. Clarence Clemens, his saxophonist and blood brother, passed away in 2011. Danny Federici, the E Street Band's keyboardist, died in 2008. Each loss carved another hole in his heart. "Losing them was like losing parts of myself," Bruce said quietly in an interview. He would sometimes speak to them before going on stage, whispering to the side of the microphone, where Clarence used to stand. His bandmates said that during rehearsals, he often paused mid-song, eyes closed, as if he could still hear them playing. These weren't just colleagues. They were family, the few who understood his language of music and pain. Their deaths brought him face to face with his own mortality, forcing him to confront the question that artists fear most: what happens when the music stops? Bruce's archive of unreleased music, what he called the vault, is massive. But buried among those tapes are songs too personal, too painful, for the world to hear. He once described them as songs I wasn't ready to live with publicly. Many dealt with aging, loss, and a quiet fear of disappearing, themes that felt too close to the truth. For years, fans speculated about an unreleased album written in the early 2000s, a stripped-down acoustic record that was said to mirror the bleak introspection of Nebraska. Rumor had it that Bruce abandoned it halfway through because it hurt too much to finish. Those close to him said that the songs were haunting, almost prophetic, reflections of a man standing at the edge of time, staring into the unknown. This hidden music became a metaphor for Bruce himself, a man filled with stories he could never quite share. In public, Bruce remained a symbol of strength, performing, smiling, greeting fans. But privately, the cracks were widening. He began canceling appearances. His interviews grew shorter, his public statements more carefully chosen. There were whispers among fans and journalists that something wasn't right, that maybe the man who had always been the embodiment of endurance was beginning to fade. When Bruce sang "One Day I Want to Be Strong Enough to Stand," it no longer sounded like a lyric. It sounded like a plea. The tragedy of Bruce Springsteen was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, heartbreaking unraveling. A life worn thin by the weight of everything he had given away. The new decade should have been a time of rest and reflection for Bruce Springsteen. After all, few artists had achieved what he had: 5 decades of music, an unbreakable fan base, and a legacy already carved in stone. But instead of peace, the 2020s brought something else: fragility. The unstoppable man was finally slowing down. In 2023, Bruce postponed his highly anticipated world tour, citing treatment for peptic ulcer disease. For the first time in decades, the machine stopped. Fans were shocked, but the announcement was carefully worded, almost comforting. Yet behind that short press release lay months of pain, exhaustion, and quiet fear. Sources close to the tour revealed that Bruce had been struggling for weeks before the cancellation. He was pushing through severe discomfort, determined not to disappoint his fans. But it reached a point where he simply couldn't go on. Doctors advised him to rest indefinitely. For a man who had built his life around the rhythm of constant motion, that stillness was unbearable. Patty later said privately to friends, "He doesn't know who he is when he's not performing." When the tour resumed in 2024, his energy was more measured, his steps slower. Yet his spirit remained, fragile but fierce. The audience roared as he raised his guitar one more time, defying the inevitable. Still, those closest to him knew, this was not a recovery.
It was resistance.
Off stage, Bruce began retreating more. The long nights of reflection grew longer. He spent hours in his New Jersey home, walking the fields alone, sometimes visiting the nearby lake to sit in silence. Friends said he spoke more often about his legacy, what he'd leave behind, what his music truly meant. "He's thinking about endings," one longtime associate shared. The man who had once sung about racing in the streets, now rarely left his property. His days became smaller, quieter, slower, a reflection of the man who had once been larger than life. It was in this period that he began writing again, not for the world but for himself. Pages of lyrics and reflections piled up, unfinished. One notebook, reportedly titled The Long Walk Home, captured his thoughts on aging, loss, and gratitude, yet even those words carried the weight of farewell. Bruce's vault of unreleased material continued to grow in the 2020s. According to insiders, he recorded several songs meant for a follow-up to Letter to You, but abandoned the project midway. The themes were too dark, too final: love fading, voices gone, the silence that comes after applause. Rolling Stone once hinted at a haunting, unspoken project that may never be heard. Fans speculated endlessly online, but no official release ever came. It was as if Bruce had reached a point where the music, his lifelong source of healing, had turned into a mirror he could no longer face. In 2024, news broke that a film based on his iconic 1982 album Nebraska was in production. Springsteen, Deliver Me From Nowhere. Though not a direct biopic, the project forced Bruce to revisit one of the darkest creative periods of his life. He had recorded Nebraska alone, on a 4-track cassette recorder, while battling deep depression. Re-entering that emotional world decades later brought up memories he thought he had buried. Those close to the production said Bruce was deeply moved, and unsettled, by how relevant those old feelings still were. He saw himself in that younger man again, one crew member said. And it scared him. The film became both a tribute and a reckoning. A reminder that the pain he once channeled into art had never truly left him. It had only changed form. By late 2024, Bruce appeared less frequently in public. When he did, fans noticed the difference. His face more lined, his voice softer, his movements slower. He was still the boss, but something had shifted, a quiet fragility behind his steady eyes. He began speaking less about the future and more about peace, faith, and time. "Every day," he said in one of his final interviews, "I try to make peace with the life I've lived." For a man who had once roared across stages, those words felt like a curtain lowering. The tragedy of Bruce Springsteen was not that he fell suddenly, it was that he faded gracefully, quietly, heartbreakingly. The man who had given everything to the world was finally left with nothing but his own silence. And somewhere in the echoes of a half-finished song, you could still hear the boy from Freehold, chasing the dream, running toward the light, unaware of how close the darkness truly was. The news broke like thunder on a quiet morning, not with a grand announcement, but through whispers that slowly grew into a roar across social media and news outlets. "Bruce Springsteen has," the headlines began, leaving millions holding their breath as if finishing the sentence would somehow make it more real. For decades, the boss had been the embodiment of strength, resilience, and raw American grit. Yet what unfolded that morning left even his most devoted fans speechless. No one could comprehend how the man who once sang about survival and redemption, who turned pain into poetry, could suddenly seem so fragile. The first images released were heartbreaking. The familiar face that once radiated confidence and boundless energy now appeared weary, etched with something heavier than time. For many, it wasn't just a tragic revelation, it was the shattering of an illusion that Bruce Springsteen was somehow indestructible. As the truth emerged, the world saw a side of Springsteen that had always existed behind the curtain, the man who carried the weight of his own lyrics. Bandmates, longtime collaborators, and friends spoke softly in interviews, describing how Bruce had continued to push himself even when the lights went off and the stage emptied. He never wanted anyone to see weakness, one close friend recalled. He believed his job was to give hope, not to ask for it. Fans around the globe reacted as if they had lost someone close. Radio stations played The River, Thunder Road, and Born to Run on repeat, each note now carrying a haunting finality. Social media turned into a massive memorial space, not of mourning yet, but of reflection. Concert venues that once echoed with cheers now stood silent, as cancellations began to roll in, one by one. The heartbreak extended far beyond the music industry. Ordinary people, truck drivers, factory workers, teachers, soldiers, the very people Bruce had spent his life singing about, shared how his songs had saved them. Now, they felt powerless to return that gift. For the E Street Band, the loss was both professional and personal. Decades of shared highways, laughter, and music now seemed shadowed by regret. They replayed the last show, the last rehearsal, wondering if they had missed any sign. A moment when his voice cracked, his eyes faltered, his spirit wavered. Each note of every performance became a clue in retrospect, a piece of a puzzle they wished they had solved sooner. And as tributes poured in, there was an unmistakable tone that blended admiration with guilt, a collective recognition that even legends can break under the weight of their own myth. When the initial shock began to fade, what remained was something even more complex, a reckoning with what Bruce Springsteen truly meant to the world. For 50 years, he had been more than a musician. He was a storyteller, a moral compass, a mirror reflecting both America's dreams and its disillusionments. Now that mirror showed something darker, the cost of carrying everyone else's burdens while hiding your own. The legacy he left behind wasn't simple nostalgia. It was a challenge, to look deeper, to see the human behind the hero. His albums became sacred texts, dissected and replayed by new generations who were discovering not just the anthems but the pain beneath them. Born to Run was no longer just about escape, it was about the impossibility of truly outrunning yourself. The Rising became a prayer for the broken, not just the brave. In interviews that followed, his children spoke softly about the man behind the myth. He wasn't the boss at home, he was a father who worried, who second-guessed himself, who found solace not in fame but in silence. He used to sit on the porch and just listen, one of them said. Sometimes for hours. I think that's when he was really at peace. Even as fans struggled to make sense of the tragedy, they began to see the lesson buried in it. Greatness and fragility often coexist in the same soul. Bruce Springsteen's story was no longer about a rock star who conquered the world. It was about a man who gave everything he had to it, even when it cost him dearly. Historians, critics, and fellow artists began to debate what his final chapter truly meant. Was it a cautionary tale about the dangers of never slowing down? Or was it simply the natural ending of a life lived fully, passionately, unapologetically? Whatever the interpretation, one thing was certain: his music would never sound the same again. Every lyric, every growl, every guitar riff was now drenched in new meaning. It wasn't just music anymore, it was confession, testament, legacy. And the question that lingered, could it have been prevented? May never find an answer. But perhaps that's what makes the story of Bruce Springsteen so deeply human. Like the characters in his songs, he lived between triumph and tragedy, between hope and heartbreak. And even in his silence, his voice continues to echo, reminding the world that every dream has a cost, and every legend is, at heart, a man. In the end, when the lights dimmed and the echoes of his voice faded into the stillness, what remained was a silence so profound that even the world seemed to pause. The image that had once shocked everyone, the sight of Bruce Springsteen, fragile and weary, sitting in a dimly lit room surrounded by old vinyl records and fading photographs, suddenly made sense. It wasn't an image of defeat. It was the truth, stripped bare of myth, revealing the cost of carrying an entire generation's dreams upon one man's shoulders. The tragedy that once confused millions was no longer just about loss, it was about understanding the depth of a life lived without compromise. For over 5 decades, Bruce Springsteen had been the voice of the forgotten, the heartbeat of the working class, and the storyteller of America's fractured soul. Every chord he struck was an act of faith, every lyric, a confession. Yet in giving himself so completely to the world, he had slowly emptied himself of the very strength that had built his legend. His story became a mirror reflecting both beauty and burden. The price of being immortal in a world that demands humanity. As fans replayed his songs, the raw ache in his voice felt different now. The gravel, the growl, the tears between the lines, all of it became sacred evidence of a man who felt everything more deeply than anyone ever realized. Those closest to him described his final days not as a decline, but as a surrender. He gave until there was nothing left to give, one bandmate said quietly.
That's who he was.
That's who he'll always be. In towns across America, candles flickered in front yards and diners played Born to Run from old jukeboxes. People who had never met him wept as though they had lost a brother, a friend, a father. His music had raised generations, healed heartbreaks, inspired revolutions, and given words to emotions too heavy to speak. And in that collective grief, there was also gratitude. Gratitude for the songs that will outlive every one of us. Gratitude for the reminder that even legends break, and that there is a strange, sacred beauty in the breaking. Bruce Springsteen's tragedy was not in his fall, it was in how long he carried the weight of hope for everyone else. His immortality was never about fame or fortune, it was about his willingness to feel the pain we could not bear, to sing the words we could not say, to dream for us when we forgot how. Now, his voice belongs to eternity. The road he sang about has no end, and somewhere beyond the horizon, we can still hear him, whispering, howling, living through the songs that defined not just a man, but the very spirit of endurance. Because legends don't die. They simply rest in the echoes they leave behind. If Bruce Springsteen's story moved you, left your heart heavy, or made you see the man behind the music in a new light, hit that like button to honor his legacy. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, so you never miss a deep dive into the lives of legends, their triumphs, their heartbreaks, and the truths the world doesn't always see.